If you are curious what sourdough discard is it wasteful, why do we do it, or have any other questions about sourdough discard, watch this video to answer all your questions. I will also show you at the end of the video how I maintain my sourdough personally so that I actually never discard. Let's go over the what, when, and why of discarding sourdough starter. What is discarding? Discarding is removing a portion of your sourdough starter. You can do this in two ways. Either removing starter from your jar and the removed portion is your discard, or you can take some starter out of your jar and place it in a new jar and feed it so that becomes your new starter. The starter that was in your old jar actually becomes the discard. This is a more accurate way of measuring because if you measure the amount taken out of the jar, you know exactly what to feed it to get a 1-1-1 ratio, or whatever ratio you are going for. This is what discarding sourdough starter is. When do you discard? You will want to discard your sourdough starter before feeding it. So whenever your feeding schedule is, whatever time you work around, for example, some people feed in the morning, some people feed in the evening, some twice a day, some once a day, some once a week because they keep her in the fridge, etc., etc. No matter your schedule, discard and then feed. Why do we discard? This is the biggest question. Why do we discard sourdough starter? Isn't it wasteful? No. We discard for 4 main reasons. The first reason is to control growth. Discarding keeps the total amount of starter manageable instead of growing endlessly. A sourdough starter is a living culture that grows rapidly when fed. And without regular discards, the volume would quickly become unmanageable. Each feeding essentially doubles or even triples the amount of starter that you have. If you don't remove a portion before feeding your starter, you'd soon be dealing with jars and jars and jars of bubbling starter. This will waste flour, space, and time because you have to feed your starter at least a 1-1-1 ratio, meaning feeding the starter at least the same amount of flour and water as there is already starter. So, if you continue to double and triple without discarding, you'd have a house full of starter with nowhere to go. Discarding helps maintain a consistent amount of sourdough starter that's easy to manage. The second reason is to maintain balance. Discarding prevents buildup of unwanted bacteria and byproducts. It reduces excess acidity or off flavors that can develop in an overgrown starter. Over time, if a starter is not regularly refreshed and a portion discarded, it can become overcrowded with both yeast and bacteria. This overpopulation leads to an imbalance in the microbial environment, often favoring the growth of unwanted bacteria that produce byproducts like hooch, a layer of alcohol that forms on the surface when the starter is hungry. Hooch isn't harmful in small amounts, but its presence signals that the starter is out of balance and potentially becoming too acidic. As acidity increases and beneficial microbes are outnumbered, the starter can develop unpleasant odors, off flavors, and reduced leavening power. Regularly discarding part of the starter before each feeding helps reset this microbial ecosystem. ensuring that the yeast and lactic acid bacteria stay in healthy proportions. This promotes a stable, active, and flavorful starter that is strong enough to rise bread consistently without sourness overpowering the flavor profile. The third reason to discard sourdough starter is to keep the wild yeast healthy. Yeast, like any living organism, needs space and a steady supply of fresh food to thrive. Every time you feed your starter with flour and water, you're giving the yeast new sugars and starches to consume. But if you never discard any of the old starter, you end up with an overcrowded environment where the food supply actually gets stretched too thin across too many microbes. Without regular discarding, the yeast can become sluggish and slow from competition and lack of nutrients. You might notice your starter rising slowly, not bubbling a lot, or even giving off strange odors or smells. Discarding before feeding ensures that you're not diluting the old culture. It is a way to concentrate the healthiest, most active yeast and give it the fresh food it needs to stay strong. This process keeps the yeast population vibrant and robust, which is essential for leavening your bread. A well-fed, properly maintained starter will rise predictably, create a light and airy crumb, and contribute to a better overall sourdough bread. The fourth and final reason to discard sourdough starter is to reduce waste. It might seem counterintuitive, but regular discarding actually helps you waste less in the long run, especially if you're not baking every day. Without discards, your starter would double in size with every feeding. Very quickly, you'd end up with a massive amount of starter that would require a huge amount of flour and water to feed properly. By discarding regularly, you keep the starter at a manageable volume, which means you're using less flour to maintain it. This is especially important for casual or occasional bakers who only bake once or twice a week, or maybe even less. Keeping a small amount of starter means less waste, less upkeep, and more control over your baking schedule. It also means you're only feeding what you need, instead of throwing out larger amounts later. So in the end, discarding is a practical, sustainable habit that makes your sourdough routine more efficient and cost-effective. My sourdough starter routine. I actually personally rarely ever discard, and this is why. I only feed my starter when I'm going to use her. Genevieve lives in the fridge most of the time, and then I'll bake for a week straight, or I'm baking for a friend, or making the communion bread, etc. When I know I'm going to use her for such an occasion, I will feed her and then use the starter that is going into my recipe as the discard. So then, that night, when I feed her again, she is around 100 grams. So she will get 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. Then, in the morning, when I start my dough and use the active starter, the amount I take out is enough to be the discard. She then sits at 100 grams until I feed her in the evening again. So I never end up wasting any because the starter that I am using in my recipe doubles as the discard. Some people say you need to feed right away, but that just isn't true. Your starter will be fine for a little while as it waits for its next feeding. When I am done, I simply put her back in the fridge until I need to get her out again. So she will stay out for a couple days, usually as I do a lot of baking, and then back into the fridge she goes when I won't be needing her for a few to several days. Sometimes I do discard when Genevieve is out, but I'm not making a recipe that morning. Let me know if you have any questions about how that whole process works. Discard recipes. Sometimes I do discard on purpose though, because there are amazing discard recipes out there. So if I happen to have any discard, I can make a sweet, savory, or crunchy discard recipe. Discard is great for certain foods because it doesn't have the power to leaven anything like an active sourdough starter does, but it simply adds tang and flavor and moisture to recipes. Some of my favorite recipes are sourdough discard pancakes, cookies, crackers, sandwich bread, pizza dough, brownies, or banana bread. If you're interested in any of those, I will leave links to those recipes below. Thank you so much for watching this video, and make sure to subscribe to Sourdough Sister for more sourdough content.